So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this webinar, which is delivered by the Humber and East Yorkshire Growth Hub. And hopefully you're here for the right reasons. We're here today to talk about starting a successful podcast. And welcome. It's great to have people joining today, and looking forward to sharing my experience of starting a podcast and hopefully inspiring you to look at doing the same thing. So quick introduction, I run a digital agency. We're actually over in Cumbria. We're called A Digital, and we work with a number of different clients, obviously providing a range of digital services, primarily website design and development, but also support those websites with digital marketing activities. And of course, one of those is podcasting. Now, we actually started our own podcast 4 years ago now. We called it the Client Side Podcast, and that gets distributed around all the usual podcast platforms. And that's what it looks like over on Spotify. And we've learned quite a lot as we've gone through over the years, and actually culminated in setting up our own podcast studio last year so we could continue to record our own episodes, but also invite clients in and help them on their podcast journey as well. So obviously that's one view of the studio, and when we're working with clients, we've had the opportunity to dress it and brand it, and obviously we've got microphones and all the kit for recording a professional podcast. But if you think it is all about being professional and having lots of microphones, this is actually how we started, just huddled around a table. What you can't see behind the camera was a team of another 5 people just the other side of a divider. Everyone on strict instructions to be as quiet as they possibly could. Sign on the door. Of course, the person delivering a parcel that day didn't pay any attention, so we had to interrupt things. So it's not always been like that. That's how we started, and very much a learning curve, which I hope today I will be able to share some of those lessons with yourself for getting set up with your own podcast. So what are we going to talk about today? The outcomes from today will be why should you podcast, and in fact, why you might not have started a podcast as well. We're going to talk a little bit about planning your show, how you might structure the episode. Of course, there's lots of different show formats that exist these days. We'll talk about recording your podcast, and this seems to be one of the big barriers for a lot of people. The fear that they need lots of kit. You certainly need a quiet place, but that's usually far easier to come by than getting lots of kit. We'll talk about production side as well. That can be another technical barrier for people getting involved with podcasting. Promotion, obviously you want to create this fantastic content. You need people to hear about it. You need people to engage with it. And then we'll talk a little bit about the project management side of things as well. For me, that is really coordinating episodes, planning those episodes, dealing with guests. And obviously, once a podcast becomes established, we've done about 35, 36 episodes of our own podcast now. I'm getting weekly emails from people saying, can I be on your show? Just found your podcast, listen to this episode, really like to be a guest. We need a way to handle that, to make it as easy and slick as possible for us. We'll talk briefly about some advanced options for podcasting, and then I've got plenty of resources which I can share, because like I say, podcasting did come with quite a learning curve for us. We've taken it to quite a professional level now, but not every company needs to do that. Of course, everything has to be measured based on how you intend the podcast to support your business, what sort of audience you're talking to, what their expectations might be. But hopefully, like I say, there'll be lots of things that you can take away from today's webinar. Finally, there's of course a chance for Q&A as well. Very happy to answer any questions at the end of the presentation. So what are the outcomes that you're going to walk away with from today's webinar? Well, first of all, you're going to come up with a winning formula to create a popular podcast. I say a popular podcast, it doesn't happen overnight. That's that photo from where we were sat around the table very much felt like we were talking to ourselves, in fact, talking to each other. We didn't have an audience at the time. And of course, we have to start somewhere. Everybody has to start somewhere. For those that might have credibility elsewhere, there may be possibilities of inheriting an audience or bringing an audience with you. But for many companies, starting their podcast means that obviously you've got your existing client base, but by and large, you're probably talking to a very small audience, and that's something that you have to build up over time. We'll talk a bit about the best recording equipment, and that is very much based on my experience. And in some cases, if you take into account the amount of recording equipment that exists on the market, that is quite limited. But we're talking about a business podcast here, something that is going to support your brand, help your marketing. We're not talking about broadcasting to hundreds of thousands of people. That may happen eventually, but I think if you get to that stage, you're probably at a point where you can hire a producer, coordinator, researcher, those sorts of things, and really up the broadcast standard that an organization like the BBC might have, or particular podcasts with large audiences. We'll talk about how you can land interviews with thought leaders, best-selling authors and influencers in your field. That can often be one of the hesitations for people to start a podcast. And then we'll look at how you can prepare a conversation or an interview with your guests so that it's engaging and it flows very well. For a lot of people, those kinds of conversations put them very much out of their comfort zone, me included, in fact, in some cases. So we'll talk about that. And then we'll look at editing your interviews so you can produce high quality and professional sounding audio. And finally, we'll talk about how you can create an effective strategy to grow your audience. So why would you start a podcast? Well, there have been dozens of podcasts produced now, dozens. That's a bit of an understatement. Millions of podcasts that have been produced now. Podcasting has actually been around for quite a while, and it really sort of became a little bit more popular with the introduction of the iPhone and Apple's iTunes platform back in 2004. But it's really only the last sort of 4 or 5 years that it's really grown into a mainstream channel, particularly for business marketing, and also as a form of entertainment. You know, we've seen over recent years how the likes of Amazon Prime Video, Netflix, and so on has grown, and their reach has expanded massively. And we've seen exactly the same sort of thing with audio content, which of course is very similar. Arguably, you've got more opportunity to listen to audio only content because you don't have to pay attention to the video. So if you're traveling, particularly if you're driving or doing other tasks, multitasking, then podcasts do make a great format. Podcasting as well can arguably be done with a little less focus and attention from listeners. So it can be there in the background, and all the while as you're having these conversations, sharing your content, you've got that opportunity to build a connection with your audience. So that opportunity there can be really strong. And I've listened to a podcast from a guy in the US for quite a number of years. And I feel like he's been invited and he's been sat next to me in the car as I've been traveling around. I've often listened to his podcast in the car, and it feels very much like he's been there alongside me in the passenger seat in very similar ways, in that we invite newsreaders at 6 o'clock, at 10 o'clock into our lounges and living rooms and kitchens and so on. We want to make a connection with our audience. Clearly, there's a business goal. Marketing and awareness is one thing, but we want to grow awareness of products and services. How can we share our content that fixes or solves a problem that our audience might have? So we want to build that awareness, and obviously that supports sales and our marketing funnel. And then, of course, the opportunity to connect with industry leaders, those people with influence or a particular opinion. They might even have particular connections. And for me, I love having the opportunity to reach out to people around a subject that I don't know as much about. Let's be honest, nobody knows everything. There are so many different elements to our work. And in my case, particularly digital marketing, there's so many different facets to it. It's impossible to know everything. But I can benefit from other people's knowledge. In the vast majority of cases, they give their time for free. They willingly share their experience and expertise. And it can be as much a learning opportunity for me as it is for guests. So those are really the reasons why you might start a podcast. But let's have a think. Oh, sorry, I've skipped a slide. Yeah, here we go. So here's a couple of stats that I can share around podcasting. So podcast listenership in the UK has increased year on year and has now reached an estimated 15.6 million back in 2020. So 15.6 million podcasts. And that's a huge reach within the UK population, and obviously that's an audience that you can have a slice of as well. And there are currently over 2 million active podcasts and more than 48 million podcast episodes, which is pretty startling growth, considering that there were only just over 500,000 active podcasts just 3 years ago. Back in 2018, and like I say, we've seen these huge investments from Amazon and Netflix in their content, and now we're seeing similar investments from Spotify and Apple in particular in terms of promoting audio content as a different format. So why haven't you started podcasting? Well, these are the things that I hear commonly that are the barriers for people starting a podcast. First of all, I hate the sound of my own voice. Well, we're all in that camp. Let me reassure you. Nobody really likes the sound of their own voice, but at the same time, your voice is what it is. You know, everybody hears your voice in the way that it's always sounded. So you really should start and feel a little bit more comfortable. You know, even once you've done a couple of episodes, you are just talking very conversationally in quite a natural way. So it's really only you that is affected and bothered by the sound of your own voice. Other people listening, you know, they're just hearing what they've always heard. So that's something that will very easily disappear over time as you have a little bit more practice recording the sound of your own voice. And obviously video and podcasts are quite similar in that sense. Secondly, it seems really complicated. Yeah, absolutely right. It can be, but it doesn't have to be. If you're looking at just starting out, setting up your own podcast, it really doesn't need to be complicated. You can keep things nice and simple. You have a smartphone in most cases that has a record feature. You can simply put a smartphone on the table and start recording a conversation. You don't have to go through and edit it. Sure, you might want to improve the production quality at some point, but maybe just as you're getting started. It's the content really that people are looking for. Granted, it has to be good quality audio, but in most cases, if you can find a quiet room, just put a phone on the table and set it recording, that will adequately record the conversation suitably enough for it to be uploaded into a podcast. Not knowing what to talk or who to talk to, yeah, that's quite a common issue as well. But it doesn't just apply to podcasts. You know, we see that across social media activity as well. Perhaps blogging activity on a website. People don't know what to write about. But I'm sure if you were to spend an hour thinking about what your audience would like to hear, what the questions they have, the answers they might like to know about, then you will very quickly come up with a handful of episodes. And yeah, we'll talk about frequency later on. Frequency definitely helps, but you need to have a plan. Having that plan gives you structure, gives you direction. It helps you to coordinate guests, helps you to plan around the topics. Even if you're subconsciously listening out, perhaps to a radio program, and there's something topical that you think, actually, yeah, I'd like to talk more about that with somebody. And those can all go into your plan. And once you've got your plan, it becomes quite straightforward, particularly if you're willing to learn and looking to learn from people that you interview as well. Think about your own skills gaps. Think about your own weaknesses. Something we don't like to do, of course, but if you can learn from, let's say, someone who is very well known for what they do or their specialism, then to be able to have that conversation actually through a podcast is a fantastic opportunity and gives you a reason to reach out and help to build your network. I haven't got time. Well, you know, that's entirely up to you, isn't it? We all struggle for time. We're all busy people. You have to dedicate some time to it. Of course you do. How much time depends, again, on how you want to run your show. You could do a solo episode. You might be someone who's very comfortable talking on their own. You're very confident about the subject matter, and you don't necessarily need to go into a lot of planning. On the other hand, you might be a little bit more like me, where you do need to spend a bit of time planning and you want to research guests and think about how the themes, how the conversation could flow. So it does take time. but you can simplify the production side. And so in our case, we've invested in a higher level of kit, so we can actually literally just record it. And then we might just want to do a few edits to chop bits out where I might have fluffed my words, or somebody coughed, or somebody knocked on the door, that sort of thing. But by and large, we're not having to make any changes to the sound quality because we're using good microphones, and that helps us. On the other side, we do a transcript. We put a transcript together that we put out on our website. We put show notes on the page as well, with links to particular articles that we might have talked about. That might be books or other websites. You don't have to do that. That's purely optional. And it's really a case of looking at what time can you dedicate to that, that makes it as quick and easy as possible. And again, I've got some tips that I'll be talking about later on in terms of how you can automate certain parts of the process, particularly around guest bookings, that will at least take out the admin, and then really you're left to focus on planning the content for the show. And again, that's ultimately what people are going to want to hear. I don't know how to get started. Obviously a common objection to starting a podcast as well, but actually you're here now, so you are getting started. So we've got over that one. I don't think we need to dwell on that anymore, and hopefully the tips and advice that follows will help you to get started. And then finally, I won't be able to get guests to talk to me. I worried about that as well, but do you know what? I don't think there's many people that say, no, I'm not going to come on your podcast. You know, people like, it's not so much like the sound of their own voice, but they can use it as an opportunity to promote their own views, their own opinions, their own products, services, companies, and of course, share that information across social media. So podcasting is a fantastic hook to reach out to people and say, I'd like to start a conversation. You know, you could contact someone. You know, again, people are busy, and it's not always going to work, but you can contact someone and say that I'd just like to have a chat. Chances are they'll turn around and say, oh, I don't know that person. I'm too busy. I haven't got the time. What's in it for me? That kind of thing. If you contact that same person and say that you'd like to invite them on your podcast, then all of a sudden there is something in it for them. And the focus of that is the podcast and not necessarily just having a chat. So there is benefit for them, and it's something that helps them to get their message out as much as your message. So lots of different formats exist for podcast episodes. You go down through the Spotify collections, loads of different examples. And I think the most common is where there is an interview with a guest. But you could go down the panel interview route where you might have multiple guests. Obviously, there can be some logistical challenges there around getting lots of people either in the same room, or at least clarity in their calendars so they can join an online conversation. But guest interviews are really one of the most popular formats because, like I say, it gives people a hook to reach out and make connections. It's also great from a distribution point of view as well, because people take the time to go and record a podcast. They will share it on their behalf, and of course that goes to their network. And if they're somebody who is, let's say, of a certain level in the industry, they've gained a certain amount of respect, they've got a particular amount of influence, then that can be a really powerful uplift to your own brand. It's the company you keep often, isn't it? And that can certainly be an influence on the visibility of your social media posts. You could get a few colleagues together and have an internal panel debate. That might feel a little less daunting to begin with because you're all in it together. Everyone's in the same situation. So that can work quite well if there's any particular industry issues or manufacturing challenges that you might have, or insights that you might be able to share with listeners. Then that kind of internal discussion can be a really good format. Like I said, you can also go solo, and you can mix and match things up. I've listened to podcast episodes that might be 3 episodes with a guest, and then there's a solo episode at the end of the month that perhaps looks back on what those conversations have covered. So you can mix and match to keep things fresh and keep listeners engaged. Obviously, people can pick and choose which episodes they listen to, or they might subscribe on a regular basis. And certainly for those that subscribe, they are looking for that fresh content. They're going to be looking for that variety. But of course, you can pick and choose which episodes you listen to, just as you do with those TV series that you might watch. So if you're starting out, you need a name for your show. You've got to brand your show and have ideally a unique name for it. Now, as we saw earlier, the number of podcast shows that exist now is pretty huge. So it's like finding a domain name 20 years later after they first came out. There is a lot of competition for names. Interestingly, can you pick a podcast or pick a name from a podcast that already exists? I think so, on the basis that we started our podcast called The Client Side, and lo and behold, I then saw another podcast show from, funnily enough, another agency, not too dissimilar to ours, which was also called The Client Side. Where do we stand with that? There's enough, I think, to go between both the businesses, so I'm not going to challenge it particularly. I'm okay with it. I can look back down our episodes and know that we were first. So I guess I don't say that they copied us because, of course, it can be difficult to go and do that level of research. But ideally, you want to find a unique name. If you do pick a name that exists that you didn't know of, chances are first thing they're going to do is say, well, can you rename your podcast? We're unhappy that we've been going for longer and you've taken our name. There's discussions that can happen around that. If you've got someone like, let's say, an Apple podcast or a huge corporate that is running a very well-established show, lots of listeners, and they've got their own name, steer clear of that. I think that's probably not going to be a sensible move. They might have the clout to come knock on your door, but ideally, choose something unique, of course, because then you own it. I think it's always useful to consider registering a domain name for your podcast based on the name that you have chosen. Couple of reasons for this. You can create an email address for the show. So obviously, if you're rounding off doing your outro, you can share that email address for people to get in touch. And you might want to set up a website for the podcast as well, depending on whether you want just to invite guests or perhaps have details of each episode and transcripts. And some of the hosting services that we'll talk about later on do offer a free website that you can connect with your domain name. So that could be worthwhile doing as well. And obviously, if you add content to your website, that's supporting SEO, search engine optimization value as well. And of course, the other question is, what are your hopes for the podcast? Are you hoping it's going to become a brand in itself? Is it a separate part of the business? Are you going to monetize the podcast? In which case, you might want to sort of look at putting some protection around the name that you've chosen. And obviously, if you're going to aim to have this brand, sometimes it's difficult to plan that from the outset. It's the sort of thing that will happen organically as your audience grows. But you can think big, and you can put things in place that as your audience does grow, it really starts to feel like it's something quite official and not just a bit of a side project. So in terms of planning your show, like all things marketing, the first thing is to think about, who are you actually talking to? Who is your audience? And everything that you do should be revolving around your audience. Don't pick a goal that helps you to grow your sales, for example. That's not really going to be the appropriate audience for people. Sorry, the appropriate goal for an audience to tune in and listen. They're looking to solve a particular problem. So you need to understand who they are. And of course, that's not by name, but in broad groups. Are they a buyer? Are they an environmentalist? Are they in a medical field? So you need to understand who they are and where they work in terms of that sector, because that sets some context around their understanding, the sort of language they might use. Are they using technical terms? Are they very conversational? Is it something that you can introduce comedy to, for example? There are certain topics and subject areas which might be more sensitive, and comedy absolutely wouldn't be appropriate. It can absolutely help from a business point of view, but again, all of this comes down to the type of content that you're wanting to share through your podcast. So ask yourself, who are they? Who is your audience? What type of language do they speak? What are the problems that they need to solve? How much time do they have? That has a huge impact on whether you're creating a show that's an hour long or whether it's 10 minutes long. And of course, that really falls back to your ability to create content on a regular basis. I see some podcasts which are weekly, but they're literally only 10, 15 minutes long. We release ours bi-weekly, and it really hovers around between sort of 35 and 45 minutes. We don't want to have particularly long episodes because we know that people are likely to be traveling. They might be in the car for 20 minutes. And we don't want to sort of have this huge episode spread across multiple different journeys or touch points from when people interact with it. So if we had a really long recording, or we felt that there was lots of content that we wanted to share, we might break that down into smaller episodes. Understanding why someone will listen to you is obviously important as well. Do you have any particular credibility? Have you written a book? Have you had the opportunity to work with someone? Have you had the opportunity to experience something like travel, for example? So why would somebody listen to you, and what is going to make your podcast stand out against listening to someone else's podcast? And then finally, we need to think about what the call to action is. Most of the time, particularly for businesses, we're starting a podcast because we want our visitors to do something having listened to it. We want them to take some sort of action. And that might be going through to your website. It might be to download an ebook. It might be to go and subscribe to something. Again, really depends around what your purpose, what you're hoping to achieve from your podcast. So those are really important points in terms of understanding your audience and how that should influence your content strategy and your delivery. Now, your show has to be categorized. So once you've created your plan for your podcast and you understand your audience, then you need to understand how Apple, particularly Apple, but how podcasts are categorized. Now, podcasts, as I said at the start, they're nothing new. They've actually been around since, certainly in the current form, since about 2004. What really made them more accessible was the introduction of podcasts to iTunes. And of course, iTunes fed through to the iPod and the iPhone when that was released. So that's the opportunity that came along that really allowed podcasts to start and broaden in their distribution. It's really only in the last 3 to 4 years that they've gone mainstream, as it were. So in the early days, podcasting was very much around niche audiences. And I've listened to a lot of podcasts, certainly from I'd probably say the late 2000s. And I'm in quite the niche that I was in was technology and marketing. And there was some very specific podcasts which have been pretty long standing, but they were from people who were the front runners with this technology. They were keen to explore it, to embrace it for their own purposes. And then they found an opportunity to create a platform for their voice, basically. So because Apple introduced podcasts to iTunes, they basically have set the precedent for how categories have been managed ever since. So you really need to be looking at the category directory that Apple has. And there are over 100 distinct categories that exist. So you can pick one from medicine to business to travel to religion, all sorts of different categories. But some of them have been particularly crowded. In fact, one of the most crowded categories has been religion. So what's really important is that you can choose a category that isn't overcrowded, because that's just going to make it harder to get your podcast featured, for example, or for it to stand out in searches. So one tactic that you can take here is to consider a subcategory as your primary category. Your religion as a whole is hugely broad, but of course there's lots of different religions across the world. So if you start to narrow down into a particular segment, then you set that as your primary category, then you're giving yourself that opportunities to stand out. So for example, instead of choosing business, we might choose a subcategory of technology and set that to be the primary category rather than just business. So categorizing your show is important because that's where it's going to help you to appear in the directories, and some of the other podcasting platforms as well will also use those categories, really, because like I said, that precedent was set by Apple back in the mid-2000s. So let's just think a little bit about interviewing guests. So we're still very much in terms of planning our show. One thing I've learned is that you really need your guests to be talking more than you do. That's the purpose of inviting a guest. And if you think of some of the great interviewers over the years, and perhaps even some of the not so great ones, but we see people like Graham Norton, Jonathan Ross very often. Michael Parkinson is another one here in the UK. Very good interviewers. and they allow their guests to speak. You have to give them the airtime. So you can't be interrupting them all the time. It can vary on the guests. Absolutely. There are some guests who are better than others. Some guests can be particularly talkative, and at some point you are going to have to cut them short. Now, obviously, when you get to editing, you might have a little bit of extra flexibility around that. If you're doing a podcast and it's not been videoed, then perhaps hand signals or things like that can encourage people to wrap up on their current point. So it's not as straightforward as being a good interviewer. You really need a good guest as well. But I think an interviewer can help a guest to feel comfortable, help them to feel at ease, and really get the best out of them. So in some cases, guests might give fairly short answers, and it's been prepared to sort of probe a little bit deeper and ask why, and explore that subject area in a little bit more depth that really helps the content to come out. So you're adding value to your audience. It should go without saying that if you are going to be doing an interview with a guest, then you really need to research that guest. It's obviously helpful to know what their background is. When you're introducing that guest, you want to give some credibility to your own show, and share the experience and the qualifications that this guest has to talk about the subject that you're introducing. So being able to research their background, any publications they might have launched, any businesses they might have launched, or sort of pro bono activities that they might have got involved with. All of those sorts of things really help to build a picture, and then, of course, help you to structure the conversation and frame it. Now, from my point of view, I'm a big fan of trying to allow the conversation to be as free-flowing as it can be. You've got to have some structure, of course, because otherwise things can overrun, and you might plan to talk for half an hour, and an hour later you still don't feel that you've quite got to the right points. So you do need to have some structure, and that's really about setting a bit of a framework, putting some questions that start off the conversation, and then, of course, you can influence the direction that takes. Sometimes you might have to pull it back on track. Again, if guests are particularly talkative, they can go off on different tangents, and you might need to pull them back towards the main point. But I would avoid the urge to script it. I find I'm terrible in front of a camera. Unless I've planned it, unless I know what I'm saying, I can very easily become tongue-tied, and sometimes I get nervous as well. We all get nervous, particularly if we're meeting a hero of ours or something like that, or someone that we really admire and respect. Of course, we want to position ourselves in a great position, so they do the same for us. So planning and researching the conversation and the guests, the things that they've done, the things that they've achieved, possibly the things that they haven't achieved or they failed at, those can all be good talking points. So do plan the conversation and frame it, but don't try to script it too much if you can help it, because it's great. You can see where that conversation goes. It can go off in all sorts of different directions, some of which can be better than others, of course. But that's where, as interviewer, you're in control, but you allow your guests the time to share their stories and share their expertise. And that means perhaps having a few backup questions just in case you get stuck. Nothing wrong with that. You're not on video in most cases, so you don't need to worry about looking down and looking away from the camera to get some prompts. And if you're not sure whether a guest is going to be quite the right fit, then consider holding a pre-interview. If you want to be really clear about what the guest is going to be comfortable about talking as well, then it can make sense to just get a 15-20-minute call before actually booking the recording, so you both know what you're going to be talking about, the type of questions that are going to come up. They can do a little bit of preparation at their side. You don't necessarily want to deliver awkward questions to somebody and sort of put them on the spot. Of course, we see that in radio interviews all the time, and that may be the type of interview that you're trying to create. So these are all parts of that planning stage, so you're understanding how you're going to work with guests and what value your listeners are going to take from each episode. So we've done a little bit of planning. We've thought about what the show is going to look like. We've thought about the structure and who we're going to approach and who we're going to invite to join us on the podcast. We're going to start and get a little bit more technical now, but not a lot. And we're into recording your podcast. So there's quite a few options for recording a podcast. I've actually been a big fan of Zoom. It's worked very well for us over the years, and that is our preferred choice. Zoom is something that's very familiar to people. There's very few people now that have not been exposed to some sort of a Zoom or Teams conversation. I haven't done a podcast with Teams, but there's no reason why you can't. And from that point of, oh, I don't know how to get started, or I don't know how to record, or I need lots of kit. Well, actually, if you have been involved in a Zoom meeting, then for all intents and purposes, that can be a podcast. If you set your Zoom meeting to record, depending on the settings that you've chosen in Zoom, you can actually have multi-track recording. And what we mean by multi-track is that if there's myself and one other person, it records one track with my voice, and then it records the other track with the guest's voice. So that means that if somebody walks in and interrupts me, the guest has not been interrupted. That audio track is nice and clean still. It just has their audio on it, rather than disrupting both my conversation and the guest conversation on the same track. So multi-track recording, that sounds complicated. It might put fear in you because you're thinking, oh, well, that's sort of sound engineer type territory. It doesn't have to be. It very simply, you have two tracks, and of course from Zoom, if it comes from Zoom, they're going to be perfectly synced up to begin with. You don't have to, you can move them around, but you don't have to get involved with doing that, because the recording starts at exactly the same time and finishes at the same time for everyone that's on the call. So that's really how we do it. We use Zoom because it's nice and easy. However, you can have problems there with internet connections and perhaps coming across sounding a bit like a Dalek at times. So Zoom, not necessarily perfect. It works well if you've got a strong and reliable connection. And by the way, I do recommend going on a wired connection wherever possible. Wi-Fi can sometimes drift in and out the strength, which can influence the quality of a Zoom recording. On the next row, we've got three options. We've got Squadcast, Zencastr, and Riverside. Now, these are subscription-based apps. You might pay sort of $10 to $20 a month on a subscription. It depends really on how frequently you're going to be using it, because a lot of these services will go by the minute. So, depending on how much time you're going to record, that will ultimately influence the price. So the benefit with those three options in the middle, Squadcast, Zencastr, and Riverside, is that they record the audio locally for each guest. That means my audio gets recorded on my computer, my guest's audio gets recorded on his computer or her computer, and once we've finished, that all gets uploaded to the cloud. And again, it's all synced up, it's all brought into line. And you've got a nice consistent recording, and you don't have the risk of internet connections breaking out because it's recorded on your machine, and that makes it nice and easy then. And obviously there's some editing services that exist within that. You can shuffle things around a little bit, but fundamentally you don't have to rely on that internet connection. And then the final option, Anchor, which didn't actually exist when we started our podcast. Anchor is a great platform. It's free of charge, which makes it a great option to get started with. It's also owned by Spotify. For most things with your website, if Google blinks, you pay attention. Same kind of thing applies for audio with Spotify or Apple as well, arguably. So Anchor actually gives you the option to record in real time, in live conversation. So you could literally have your microphone on and just start talking. You set the record button, obviously, have your conversation, save it. It'll save into Anchor, and obviously then it's primed and ready just to hit the publish button. If you go for the Squadcast, Zencastr, or Riverside options, you will have to download an audio file, and then you will have to do something with it. At a simple level, that is just uploading it to your podcast host, and we'll talk a little bit about that later on. But your podcast host is the organization where they provide the server, the storage for your podcast audio files, and they will take care of the distribution as well. So they will distribute your podcast out to the various different services. So we'll talk more about that shortly. So those are your recording options. And like I say, Zoom is a great option to get started with. It's free in some cases, of course. Many companies probably using a paid plan after the pandemic, but it's familiar. It's very easy for people to use, very easy to get a hang of. The only thing that I do remind people to do is hit the record button, because there's nothing worse, and touch wood, it's not happened to me, but there's really nothing worse than going through a half-hour, 40-minute conversation with somebody and then realizing that it hadn't been recorded. So let's talk a little bit about some equipment, and I've broken this down into 3 levels. So we've got basic, intermediate, and advanced. So as I said earlier on, the basic option is just to record from your phone. You've got an audio recorder on your phone. You can sit opposite somebody else and very easily have a conversation between yourself and a couple of other colleagues. It's not going to sound great, admittedly, particularly if you've got 3 or 4 colleagues and you're all huddled around the phone. You are going to have to get quite close together to be able to, for the microphone basically to pick up your voice and for it not to sound like you're stood at the back of the room. So there are limitations, of course, but if you're doing a solo episode or you're just testing the water and doing a little bit of a trailer, then you can do that on your phone. If you've got a 2-way conversation, you could do that on your phone. And that is assuming it's, you know, people sat opposite each other, not so much recording a phone conversation. That obviously introduces some other challenges. So you can also use your phone for a Zoom call, of course, as well, if you are having a guest. So that would be preferable rather than trying to record a phone conversation. You would just record your Zoom call. And headphones can be useful. Headphones can, in fact, I think headphones can be useful in every case. They're certainly not necessary, but particularly with a phone, it does give you the option of cutting down on feedback. What you don't want is the other person talking and for that audio that's coming out of the phone to automatically be sucked back in by the microphone. So there is an element of noise cancellation when you're using these devices, but your headphones do cut that out completely, and that does make things a bit easier. If you're wanting to go a little bit more advanced, then the intermediate level really uses, you use something like a USB microphone. Of course, you can use a microphone that's built into your laptop. That has challenges though, because if the fan starts to go off, or I don't know, let's say there's a bit of a vibration coming through the table from other people, or even some sort of air conditioning system or a fan that might be on the table, then those sorts of things will get picked up far more prominently with your computer microphone. So this is where, again, a USB microphone will come in a little bit more flexible. It's dead easy to plug in, nothing really to connect. It plugs straight into your computer. You can change your settings within Zoom to use that microphone. You can still use headphones as well, of course, to cut down on the background noise and the sound of your guest voice being captured on your own microphone. So they're pretty economical. They're not particularly expensive. You can get USB microphones probably from I would say around about £40 to £100, give or take. Obviously, it can depend on the type of microphone, the type of the brand. But generally speaking, that's going to get you a much better result than using a built-in microphone. Obviously, they're compressed into the small space, the container of the device and the hardware. So being able to use an external microphone will achieve better results. And then finally, if you were wanting to go more advanced, then you can get an XLR microphone. That is a microphone that uses something called an XLR cable, and that is purely the cable type, and that will then feed into some sort of audio device. That might be commonly known as an audio interface, or in the case here in the studio, I've got a mixing device. So it plugs into there, and that has a USB that then plugs into the computer. I can feed that through different devices as well. I can do different settings around headphones. I can turn volume up and down within the mixer, do all those sorts of things on the fly as we're recording. So obviously you're at a much more advanced level at that stage. You can also get 2 types of microphone as you get to that advanced level. You can get a condenser microphone and a dynamic microphone. I'd really recommend that you use a dynamic microphone for podcasting. What that basically means is the sensitivity within the microphone will adjust according to the volume that is going through it. So as I'm very close to the microphone, it's going to turn down the sensitivity around any background noise, and that's what I want. So if there is a fan in the background, or somebody knocks on the door, or there's someone outside on the landing that's having a conversation, then if I'm talking loudly into the microphone, chances are that audio is not going to get picked up. Condenser microphones, on the other hand, are far more sensitive. They can produce better quality, but if you then have to deal with editing, background noise, and things like that, a dynamic microphone is going to be far and away better. Plus, if you are just starting a podcast, remember you are going to have a small audience. In most cases, you might be able to bring an audience with you or inherit an audience, that sort of thing. But chances are you're going to have a smallish audience. And the goal should not really be to try and create a broadcast quality interview. Yes, it wants to have good audio. It's got to be audible. And you don't want to have sort of background noise and distractions, but some of that just comes down to your own microphone technique as well. So, for example, moving away to cough and avoiding sniffing, those sorts of things, which will all get accentuated when you listen back to it. And that's one of the things that often people find embarrassing about the sound of their own voice. So, what does that look like? Well, if you've got going down the basic route, I would suggest something like a Rode Smart Mic, and that's very easy. It's about £40, and you can get that extra device there that will just plug into the socket on your phone, and that allows 2 microphones to be put in and 1 set of headphones. You probably only need 1 set of headphones because that will carry both tracks, and it just means that the audio isn't going to get picked up by the microphone. And of course, if you sat opposite each other, you're having a conversation anyway, so the headphones are a little bit immaterial. You can hear each other. Using headphones allows you to hear the sound of your own voice. Again, not something people are comfortable with, but it does at least allow you to hear what a listener will hear as and when it gets published. So you could start off with that basic setup using your phone, assuming you've got a phone, obviously, which most people do. You're probably going to be looking about £60 to £70 for those 2 devices to do your recording. If you're looking at a more intermediate level, a microphone that we started with was the Samsung Q2U, and that's actually pictured there on the left-hand side. It came with a little tripod, and actually that is an XLR microphone and a USB. It supports both, so we had a little bit of flexibility, a little bit of growth room with that. So that was a really good option for us, and that worked both ways. Another very popular product is the Blue Yeti, and then Rode do a lot of microphones, a lot of professional level microphones, but obviously they've got various different levels. There are entry level products, and I forget what that particular product is that I've included there in the picture. But you are probably looking, I think we paid about $60 in the end. We found that Samsung mic over in the US. You can get it in the UK. I think just at the time they were out of stock, so we got ours from the US. But around about $60, £60, give or take, for those microphones, and we got 2. Obviously, if you're going to have guests, then you might need 2 of those. It comes with all the cables that you need. Comes with the stand as well. It comes with a little cover. They call it a pop filter that just goes on the top as well. So so you can use that, plug it into your computer, connect to Zoom, and away you go. And then for the more advanced, our own particular setup is using the Rode Podcaster, and we've got that mixing deck. We're not actually using the microphones that are pictured there, but we are using the mixing deck that you can see, and that has got some built-in processing capability. So, for example, if I was to start talking fairly quietly and then I suddenly laughed very loudly, I get this big difference in the volume. And this mixer has got, like I say, it's got some post-processing built into it. So it will do its best to try and level out that volume, so it's not constantly going really loud, really quiet, and so on, and you get a consistent level. I'm sure you'll have found this when you've listened to music before. Sometimes you can play a track and it's really loud. Sometimes the next track can come along, or you play a different track. You haven't changed the volume, but it sounds either louder or quieter. That's just a difference in the levels. So you obviously want to try and get a consistent level as you can. And then as people go from one episode to the next, it's a consistent volume. So we have the Rode Podcaster. We use Rode microphones as well. So that system all talks to each other and sits together very well. Of course, there are lots of other different mixing decks. You can also get Zoom recorders. Zoom is a brand name, nothing to do with Zoom, the video conferencing platform. But if you're out and about or you need to plug in different microphones, then you can use those recorders as well. They're a little bit more expensive. They're a professional piece of kit. You probably pay anything from about £250 upwards for a Zoom recorder. For that kind of setup that you see pictured there with the mixing deck and the microphones, you're probably going to be looking at £600 to £800. So it is quite a bit more of an investment as you go up from basic through to intermediate and through to advanced. But of course, all it's going to come down to is the quality of the episode that you're trying to produce, the quality of the production. And there is absolutely nothing wrong with starting basic and building up as you grow. You will build an audience, and fundamentally it's the content that you want people to hear. The production can follow. And of course, you've got to be able to promote the show as well. You've got to have people to tune in. So those are probably more important considerations than getting the right equipment. But there's options there that you can choose. I think if I was to give my advice, I would probably err towards that intermediate side first. Yes, you can go down the basic route. If you are going to get the microphone there and the splitter device, by the time you've done that, you might as well have got a USB microphone that gives a little bit more flexibility because you can use it with your computer and not just your phone. And obviously that then opens up things like Zoom and other Squadcast or other platforms, because of course we're talking today about creating your own podcast, but there's no reason why you might not want to be a guest on someone else's show for all the reasons that a guest would come on your show. And obviously having some decent kit to support that can be a real advantage. So let's move on to talking about producing your podcast. And there are a number of different platforms that you can use. And I'm slightly hesitant here because these two have a learning curve. They really do. So the first one is called Audacity. That is a free platform. It's free software that you can download. And arguably, it's a little bit more simple because it's free. And you can move your tracks around, you can cut them up and so on. And then you can export them as an MP3 file. On the right is Adobe Audition. That is what we use because we have access to Adobe's Creative Cloud, and that is one of the software applications that sits within that. I don't think I would have bought it as a standalone product, but because we've got it as part of the wider suite, it makes sense to use it. But you can use simpler tools like iMovie, which of course you can get on your phone. There's no video track, but you've got your audio and you can cut that up and you can move things around. So if you've done any video editing, audio editing is very similar and arguably easier because you don't have to coordinate the video and the motion with the audio. So it really is just a case of, you have your track that shows along the screen, you can cut it, delete the bit that you don't want, and then just shuffle the tracks together to close the gap. And obviously that's how you can cut out instances that you might not want to be broadcast. You might not want the guest coughing or tutting, or if there is an interruption, then obviously you wouldn't really want that to be included on the final episode. If you were to use either something like Audition or Audacity, this is actually what it looks like. And, I include it here just not to overwhelm people. It does look complicated. There is a lot of moving parts, but it doesn't have to be like that. And I think in many cases, that's where looking for a third party to edit your content can be very helpful. They're using this kind of software all the time. And sometimes if you buy in bulk, so for example, you get 10 episodes, it might cost you £500 for editing. £50 an episode is pretty good value, I think, because you would quite comfortably unless you've got a real desire to get to know this platform, you'd probably quite comfortably spend 3, 4, maybe even longer, a full day in terms of getting your head around how a piece of software like this works. And I've done it, but it has taken a huge amount of time. I've watched a huge number of YouTube videos, and quite frankly, I've barely scratched the surface with this software. It does what we need it to do. We've got it to a stage where we've refined our process and we can make it work. But this is really a professional tool that you would expect DJs and radio stations to be using to produce ads and jingles. And you're getting into sound engineer territory, and that starts to take the fun away from podcasting. The fun is all about having the conversations and promoting those conversations. You don't want to take that fun away by getting bogged down in the production. And of course, the production is a bottleneck to getting episodes out there. And that's the only way that your audience will grow. So another option for editing, if of course you even need to edit, is to look at a platform like this. This again is something that is off the shelf, and there is basic pricing. I can't remember what its cost might be, sort of £10-20 a month. Again, it's going to depend on how much content you're uploading. But as you can see, it's got some automation in there. It's very easy to use. You can upload your audio files once they've come off your phone, put them in there, and that will do all the stuff that this mixing deck that I've got here will do, among other things. Obviously, we get a little bit more flexibility with this, and we can record more tracks. But something like this will take away the pain of the editing process for you, or of course, outsourcing it to a sound engineer or audio editing company. I think it's great practice to include show notes and links from your podcast on your website. That might be a dedicated website for the podcast, or it might be a section on your own website. We've done it in that way. We haven't got a dedicated website for the podcast, but we do have our own domain name for it. So we can have an email address that we can use as a shout out at the end of the episode for people to contact us. But putting the episode up on your website adds some SEO value. You can obviously put the content there, and search engines will index that. Who knows where indexing audio content will go in time. At the moment, there is no way, or certainly not something that we've seen, where Google is indexing audio content. But who knows, with this growth in podcasting, it's quite possible that they will find a way to index the content within the podcast. But until then, adding a transcript of the episode to your site is one way to help draw traffic to it. It's also good practice to make your content accessible to the widest possible audience. Now, again, you have to take a view on this. Accessibility is absolutely essential, but you do have to consider your audience. Who are they? Do they have any special needs? Are they likely to need the transcript? And also, is your audience sort of 10, 20, 30, 50 people? Because the process of creating the transcript does add more time into the production. So you've got to be able to justify it as well. I would absolutely advocate having it, because it's the right thing to do to make your content as accessible as you possibly can. But I do understand that there are limitations around producing content, and sometimes some content is at least better than no content. But by having that transcript and the show notes on your site, you are also giving people a reason to visit your website. That call to action that we've talked about, visit our website to find the show notes. Oh, while I'm on the website, I might just have a look at your products and services. Oh, how do I contact you? And of course, you're building a relationship. The more you speak to people, the more episodes, the more people are listening to you and feeling a connection with you. So if people go through to your website, hopefully, you've already kicked off some of that initial sales process. You've already given them the confidence that you are someone that knows what you're doing. And therefore, when that inquiry comes through, starting from potentially a warm lead rather than a cold lead, where you've still got to convince people of the benefits of taking your product or service. And as I say, you're leading your listeners into your sales funnel with that call to action. So again, another good reason to have some sort of page where your website can do details of the podcast. And of course, it builds up a library, builds up a catalog of content. And over time, if you're going to make a commitment to this, that will build up pretty quickly. So this is what we have on our site. We have an introduction to the episode. We've got the date that it was recorded, the time, the duration, who we've interviewed. Obviously, we've got the title. Then we've got the links out to all the different platforms that the show can be found on. We've got Spotify, Apple, and Google, among others. Then we've put a player on the page, which has come from our podcast host, so we can just play the audio here on the website, get a sample of it, rather than necessarily going out and subscribing via iTunes, for example. And then further down, we pull out a quotable quote from the episode, and those are things that you can share out across your social media platforms. We've got links out to products, platforms, or services, books, LinkedIn profiles, whatever it might be that the guest brought along with them. And then we've got the transcripts there, which allows us to output all of the audio in written form. And actually, we use an automation service for that. We use a service called sonics.ai, and that will do an automated transcript for us, but it does need to be humanly checked. You cannot rely on it to give you 100% accuracy, because obviously people have different accents, people speak quickly, slowly, etc. Sound quality can vary as well depending on who you're speaking to. So it's a great way to get the bulk of your transcript done, but it will need some sort of editing for you to maintain credibility as you go forwards. Another popular transcript service that I hear of, I haven't used, is rev.com. But I'm sure, like most things, there's a handful of different solutions for these types of challenges. When you are going to publish your podcast, you need to have artwork. You need to have a cover image, and that has to be 3,000 pixels by 3,000 pixels at its maximum, and it needs to be in a JPEG or a PNG format. I think the minimum size is 1400 by 1400, but I would always advocate going for the biggest size, because then you've got flexibility depending on where that appears. Bearing in mind it'll appear on all the different podcast platforms and different devices as you're playing that episode. So I think bigger is better, and then you've covered all bases. The other point is, with artwork, you need a podcast artwork, so for the overall production, and then you can have individual artwork for each episode. So there's no reason why you have to stick with the same artwork through and through. That will reflect the episode. So when somebody does a search for the podcast by title, that will come up. And then when you get into episodes, you can have a different piece of artwork for each episode, but obviously it needs to follow the same specifications as the main cover image. So let's move on to how you might promote your podcast. And the most common distribution for podcasts is Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. Obviously, in terms of mobile devices, most people are, pretty much you're either on Apple or you're Google. And of course, Spotify being cross-platform, that works on both. And Spotify clearly has huge listeners, numbers of listeners and subscribers too. And alternative platforms then, certainly in terms of where our podcast goes, Amazon Music, Acast, TuneIn, Pocket Cast, Deezer, Breaker, Stitcher. Amazon, obviously, you've probably heard of. Deezer for me was like a music sharing service way back. Well, I don't know, say way back, showing my age, probably about 10 years ago. Quite honestly, we don't really use those, but there's no harm in having the distribution. And ultimately, that's what you want. You want the platforms you want your episodes rather to be distributed across as many platforms as possible, because that's maximizing your reach, maximizing your audience. One platform I haven't included there is SoundCloud. That is an option, but it does tend to be used more by musicians and bands rather than podcasters. So that doesn't really apply for me. And plus, if we look at where you can then host your podcast, Anchor is actually free. It's completely free. So there's no reason really to go anywhere else. You might as well use, well, caveat that there is a reason to go somewhere else, but you might as well host your podcast through a dedicated podcast service. rather than something that just allows you to play audio files, because the needs can be quite different. So Anchor is an obvious choice now. Like I said, it didn't exist when we set up our podcast. It is completely free to use. It is set up by Spotify, so it's obviously going to feed into Spotify, but it will also feed your podcast into Apple, Google Podcasts with no further action needed. You don't need to do anything. You go, you create your podcast, create your episode, and it will take care of that distribution for you. If you're planning to launch on a certain date, you can publish your podcast for, let's say, Monday, but it might not appear in some of those other platforms for 2 to 3 days. So you do need to release something in advance, whether it's a quick trailer ahead of any particular launch date. And then you'll be well prepared for when your actual episode has to go out, if you need it to go out on a specific deadline. Because it does take 2 or 3 days for the files to sort of percolate, if you will, across the various different platforms from Anchor. If you do want to go somewhere else, there are paid options. And like I say, Anchor is an excellent choice because it is free and it's got a great service, great features, very simple to create a basic page for your podcast. But it's all going to be branded with Anchor. You can change the color scheme, you can upload a logo, but you can't have any influence over the page layout. And basically you're governed by their templates. So looking elsewhere, that starts to open up options in terms of how your content can be presented, how it gets distributed, where it gets distributed, and then there can be certain other features that apply as well. So we use a service called podcast.co. They're actually based in Manchester. It's nice to work with a UK-based company for this type of thing. But other platforms, Acast, Libsyn, Buzzsprout, Podbean, Blueberry, and Spreaker. I think Spreaker is actually owned by Sonos, if I remember rightly. But those are all alternative platforms. They will all have a similar subscription fee. Probably, again, it's going to depend on the amount of content you're producing. I would say between sort of £15 and £30 a month. Typically, you'll be charged in dollars as well, because that's how SaaS apps works these days. Most prices are charged in dollars. But like I say, you can get some extra features. So with podcast.co, for example, we can create something called an audiogram, and I'll show you one of those shortly. And we can also include a certain amount of transcript content as well that can be automated once we've added our content and uploaded the files. So those are where you basically you choose a podcast host, something that matches your needs in terms of the features, the pricing, and they will take care of the distribution out to all the different channels. Now, of course, you are going to have to do some promotion activity around your content. You can't just create that content and expect people to find it. So you can create trailer episodes for your podcast. That might be a single trailer for the overall season or series of podcasts that you're producing. And a lot of companies do seasons of podcasts, just the same way as the big producers like Netflix will. They'll perhaps do a season of 8 or 10 episodes, then they'll take a break. And they can perhaps revolve those seasons around different themes as well. So you can create trailer episodes for those seasons, or for individual shows even, depending on the amount of time you have. Certainly some of the shows I listen to have a trailer for each individual episode. A bit more time involved in doing that, but if you've got the time, you've got the capability, obviously you've already got the audio file, so it is a little bit of extra work, but it's not like you're having to necessarily re-record something. Always look for quotable quotes from the conversation. And, these aren't necessarily going to be your quotes. These are going to be from your guests, because ultimately you're trying to position yourself as rubbing shoulders, sharing the same company as your guests. You're wanting to help them demonstrate their influence. And you're approaching them because of the expertise that they have. So those quotable quotes will normally come from your guests, and I would suggest looking for 2 to 3 of those. Just make a note of the time, and then you can go and pick them out and put them on some sort of social media graphic. I've got an example which I'll share in a moment. But I think if you can create those graphics yourself, or at least perhaps with some sort of virtual assistant, or perhaps someone in-house, marketing exec or content manager, then it makes it easy for your guests to promote the episode. And that's part of the battle. We are trying to reach into their audience. We're trying to reach into people who have connected with them, because we never know where those connections might go. And again, like I said, that's one of the fantastic opportunities with podcasting, is you can reach out to people for a conversation that ordinarily they might just say no to. But if there's something in it for them, you've got an opportunity not only to have a fantastic conversation, but like I say, to reach into their audience as well. Obviously, you want to be asking for reviews and ratings, currently only on Apple Podcast. There are some podcast hosting services that allow you to independently review episodes, and those are certainly worth exploring. But by and large, you've got a big audience on Apple Podcasts, so you really want to be capturing reviews and ratings there if you can. So ask people, send them a link, put a link at the bottom of your show notes page to leave a rating and review, and obviously that's going to help you appear more strongly in the algorithms when people are doing a search, because they're perhaps unlikely to search for you by name. Of course, if they do, you would hope that you're going to come up. But if they're looking for new material, they don't know about your podcast, then your ratings and reviews will influence where you appear. You can also send email notifications of new episodes. So, I don't know, you probably want to get into a routine of a regular publish date, so it doesn't just come out at random. People can expect it. People can see it pop up in their feed. And you might want to give them a gentle nudge by sending out an email newsletter that reminds them that the podcast is available. It might have a summary of who the guest is, what the content is, what the discussion points were, perhaps what the quotable quotes were. There's all sorts of ways that you can notify people of those new episodes by email. And as I said earlier, be consistent with episode releases. For the second and first year that we ran the podcast, we weren't. And that really changed. As soon as we hit that consistent release schedule, we saw our listeners go up quite quickly through the analytics provided by our podcast host. So the consistency really does make a difference. And arguably, the more frequent that you're releasing content, the better, the quicker your audience will grow. So here's an example of a quotable quote that we created for somebody. And we basically just picked out the quote. We've created a nice social media graphic there, and that's very easy for us to post on our channels. It's something that we can send out for them to post on their channels as well. So we've got that opportunity to reach into their audience. But crucially, we're making it easy for that to happen. We're not putting any barriers in the way. We're not expecting other people to do it. It might be that they do. They might have really enjoyed the conversation, and they might have feel that they really want to promote it. But generally speaking, in my experience, once people have been a guest, that's it. They kind of put the time in. So you really want to give them a nudge to make sure that the podcast is promoted and that information gets shared. So creating some graphics like this is a nice and easy way to do that. I mentioned earlier something called an audiogram. This example that you can see here is a static quote, but if we look at this next example, this is an audiogram which can go basically as a video onto platforms like Instagram or LinkedIn or Twitter, and this is what an audiogram looks like. Okay, so I don't know just how much that audio will have come through, but as you can see, you've got the sound wave, the audio bar jumping around, so you can see there is audio, but actually you don't have to have the sound turned on. And we know from people's social media habits, they don't always have the sound turned on, but they can see the audio, they can see the content as it's flowing across the page, a little bit like a karaoke machine. So it can be a little bit more engaging for people to watch. And obviously they get a little bit more than just the quotable quote. You can put video content up for slightly longer periods. If it's going on Instagram, it is capped at a minute. But if it's going on to other platforms like LinkedIn, then you can put slightly longer snippets, or even a trailer of that particular episode that will help to promote it. So those are a couple of examples of promoting your episodes. Let's look a little bit at the project management side of things. Time, as I said at the beginning, is one of the strong arguments as to why people don't do a podcast. So you really need to make the most of your time so you can focus on the good stuff, the fun stuff, the conversations with people, not fighting over hardware and technology around editing and so on. So as much as possible, we have automated the process, particularly around guest registrations. That is something that is a common process. It's the same every time. We want the same information from guests every time. So we have automated that process so there's no admin around actually getting somebody involved with the podcast if they want to. We might need to give them a little bit of a nudge and a cajole to get them there, but once they're into that process, it is automated. So we've created some content assets and templates that allow us to make it easy for people to feel that it's going to be simple and straightforward for them to join us on the podcast. We've also got to a stage now where we're 35, 36 episodes, have been doing that over the last 3 to 4 years, where we get a lot of emails coming in now saying, oh, I've got a guest for your podcast. We don't always want to take those guests because we can tell people haven't really read the brief. They've not really listened to the show. They'll say, oh, yes, we've listened to such and such an episode. But in terms of what they're pitching and what they can bring to the show, quite clearly, they haven't listened to the show. So we do have templates that make it very easy for us to respond to pitches. I don't like them going into a black hole. So we do tend to respond to those and say that we've considered it not a suitable guest or not a suitable subject area. And for that reason, we have set some minimum criteria for who we'll accept as guests. That's not by way of qualification. Well, technically it's by way of qualification, but not their qualifications. We're not looking for people, for example, who've only got a degree or anything like that. But we want to qualify our guests as someone suitable for the podcast. And obviously that's going to come down to the type of content that you're producing, who your listener base is, and all those sorts of things. So do set sort of a minimum criteria for who you'll accept as guest. It might be that they need to have achieved something in particular, like maybe published a book. They might need to be the CEO of a business. They might need to be in a particular field. Those are those sort of minimum criteria that you can very quickly qualify somebody in or out as suitable for the show. And as I said earlier on, you can always arrange a quick pre-interview to pre-qualify them and determine whether they're going to be a good fit for what you want them to share. And then finally, follow up with guests, connect with them on social media, thank them for their time and contribution. Not once have we paid for a podcast guest, and there may well be some people who insist on some form of payment. We've never paid for a podcast guest, so we are massively grateful for people giving up their time. Of course, as I've said repeatedly, there is something in it for them. They are appearing on some sort of content production, so they're going to appear in a search engine. They're going to be spoken about. They're going to have their profile raised by appearing on a podcast. So in most cases, people won't ask for something. But the worst thing that you could get to is where you've created the podcast, it's all produced, it's ready to go, and they turn around and decide, actually, no, I'm not very happy with that. So do liaise with guests. You don't have to be checking every detail in terms of how the edit's been done, but give them the opportunity to say, was there anything that you're not happy about? Is there anything that you would like to take out? Because ultimately, you are in some ways piggybacking on their brand. Particularly as a small business, if you're running a podcast, you're looking for people with that level of influence, with that level of credibility, and arguably you are piggybacking on their brand. So give them the opportunity to say what they are and what they might not be happy with. And that might mean sharing the show in advance. Some people might be more interested in that than others, but at least as a very minimum, thank them for the time and the contribution that they've made, and confirm when the show has been released. In terms of finding guests, that was a blocker that we talked about earlier on. There is a service here that I use called matchmaker.fm. A couple of screenshots here. It is basically a podcaster's directory. You can create a profile page, which you can see there on the top right, that shows my availability, the type of equipment that we've got, the type of subjects that I'll happy to talk about. And I've actually put a video in there as well, so people can see the type of equipment that we've got and the type of topics that I can talk about. Hopefully it comes across as a confident speaker as well, and they feel that that I've got a certain level of expertise and experience to be able to go and have a conversation with somebody. But from the other screenshots, you can see there are directories, and you can search by category, by location, by language, all sorts of things. And obviously that is a huge pool of people that you can find for guests, and they're obviously inclined to join you as a guest because they're registered on a platform like this, specifically around podcasting. Other options are, of course, things like LinkedIn. Depending on who you're looking for, are they CEOs? That could be a great option. Go and look down LinkedIn. Are they authors? Well, go and have a look down Amazon, see what the latest releases are. If you've got people that have just published a book, then chances are they'll be pretty open to appearing on a podcast and talking about it. So there's plenty of places where you can find guests, and feeling that you're stuck for guests really shouldn't need to be a reason not to proceed and get a podcast up and running. In terms of the process that we follow, this is the automation that we have. We set up a Google form where we can get people to fill in their details. And effectively, we're getting them to do the work. We've asked them, we've invited them to be on a podcast, but we're then asking them to fill in this form with their bio, upload their photo, their company details, any particular links that they might want to talk about in the show. That comes straight into this kind of document over on the right-hand side. So we've got it all ready for when we start the research process. We can see their background. We've got the picture, so we can upload that into the show notes and onto the artwork. We have got our guests very easily to do that work for us, so we're not having to chase them. The other side of it is booking a time for recording. So we use a service called Calendly. That obviously makes it very easy for people to go and choose a suitable date and time. It also integrates with Zoom, so it creates the Zoom invite there and then, and that comes back and slots itself into their calendar with the Zoom link. So very easy for them to get started. We've also set some expectations around what format the interview will take. Like I say, usually we'll start with a 15 to 20 minute discussion off air before we start recording, which will then run for about 30 to 40 minutes. And then, as you can see where it cuts off, we recommend reading our guide, which looks a little bit like this. So we've produced a two-sided A4 document that just has some basic information for podcast guests. As I say, if you've been on a Zoom call, that for all intents and purposes is not really that dissimilar to joining a podcast. However, there are some key points that we want people to take away. So, for example, close all non-essential applications, put your phone or your computer into do not disturb, switch off Slack or email, because we don't want the ping every time there's something that drops into the inbox, because that kind of audio can be difficult to cut out. It's doable, but you really want to try and get as much of the audio recorded in a single take as you possibly can. So you're minimizing and reducing the amount of editing that is required. Obviously, we're asking people to promote the show. Can they recommend a guest? Is there someone else that they could introduce us to? And then is there any additional contact information in case of a complete technical failure? We've put an email address in there, also a WhatsApp number. So people can get in touch with us if they need to, if something has come up and they either having technical difficulties or they're unable to connect to the recording service. So something like that's very helpful and puts people at ease. Obviously, it looks professional as well. If you're then wanting to get a little bit more advanced with your podcasting, you can monetize the show. Some people will set out with that objective in mind. Of course, others are there to provide information and add value for their existing clients and prospects. But you can monetize your podcast with sponsorship or even ads. Of course, you will really have to have a bit more of an audience for that to work. But once you get to a certain stage, of course, you could pitch relevant companies and say, look, I have this audience, I have a podcast. And for many, you're going to carry on doing the podcast anyway. For most people, it is a bit of a side project. It's not something that is becoming the business. So, even just a small contribution, even if it's £100, £50 an episode, it's better than nothing. And it helps just offset some of the cost of the production Sponsorship can be quite easy. Sometimes, for example, we've had an opportunity to have sponsorship. There was no money changing hands. We thought we'd give it a go. We were keen from a credibility point of view. There was a good fit. They were keen because obviously they thought there'd be reach for a new audience, not just the day the podcast goes live, of course, because these podcasts, once they're out there, they stay up there. Obviously, we could take them down, but people can listen to the podcast that we produced 2 years ago today. There'll be slightly different quality, arguably. But again, progress, not perfection. And so therefore that sponsorship can actually have quite a bit of longevity. And sometimes it can be that credibility rather than necessarily a financial incentive. You can create paywalled content now as well with a podcast. So you can have premium content on channels. And obviously you could then create a subscription for people to access that premium content. And then you can move forwards by increasing the production value with jingles and audio branding, things like that. Your background music as you're talking through the introduction. Lots of different ways that you can enhance the production value of your content. And then you might want to look at automation. So I've given a couple of examples of automation in terms of how we manage our guests. But for example, when you add something to your website, perhaps that triggers an email to say the most recent podcast is now live. There can be all sorts of different areas where you might be able to introduce automations that ultimately make the admin and the project management and the promotion of the podcast a lot easier and less time consuming. So a handful of useful resources, because as I said at the beginning, there's been a huge learning curve for me in terms of how I've learned through the software, how I've learned by doing. And these are some of the resources that I can recommend. Music Radio Creative are based on the Isle of Wight. They've got a huge library of videos and online lessons, but they've also got professional editing services, voiceovers and jingles. The Podcast Host is a fantastic resource, lots of details on kit over there. So if you are looking at choosing some kit, the Podcast Host has lots of articles around different types of equipment. Podcast.co is the podcast host that we use for our own podcast, but they've got a YouTube channel which has got some good content on there. James Mulvaney is quite a prolific podcaster. He's actually the founder of podcast.co and matchmaker.fm. And he produces a lot of videos on his own YouTube channel as well. So we'd normally go into Q&A at this point, but as this is a recorded webinar, I'm going to skip on from that and thank everybody for watching this video. We've covered a huge amount of content. Hopefully it's been helpful, and I really hope it encourages you to set up and start your own podcast, and you can enjoy the process and see the benefits come back from having a podcast into your own business. So thanks very much for joining me. Really appreciate your time, and I wish you all the best.